Hiya, Tennis Mr. Truman here again. I'm just going to address another key question with you. Again, I'm focusing on Shakespeare because I know that's what you've been focusing on in your Zoom sessions, but also in some of your work booklets. The big question that I'm going to address with you this week is, how does Shakespeare present the role of the supernatural and witchcraft in Macbeth? And you should know by now is that actually the role of the supernatural and witchcraft is quite significant within the play, and that's presented through the role of the witches. And the witches are actually seen as catalysts for the main event. They're almost seen, certainly in the beginning in Act 1, to plant that seed of ambition in Macbeth. Then ultimately it grows, and actually that causes his downfall. So they are closely linked, certainly with his fall as the tragic hero, but they're also linked to the other evil acts. So they are and were seen as symbols of evil. Within the time of King James I, when he was in reign, is the interest in witchcraft actually bordered on hysteria. A lot of people were greatly fearful of witches for a number of reasons. However, they were closely associated with illness, with death, disaster, and actually were thought to punish people by giving them nightmares. And again, that links very closely to Act 2, when Macbeth is killed King Duncan, and he mentions that he's going to lose sleep and that he hears a knocking, again implying that he's done these awful acts, which again can be linked very closely to the acts that witches were said to perform and carry out. They also are used to connect and combine the natural world with the non-natural world. We see that certainly in Act 1, the witches and Banquo's and Macbeth's paths clash. They're actually waiting for Macbeth and Banquo to return from battle. However, we do see in Act 4 that Macbeth actually goes to them in their unnatural world. They were also associated with this kind of overwhelming ambition to achieve power. Many people thought that witches would do anything to gain power within society, and I think that can be very closely linked with Macbeth, certainly by the end of the play. Now, what's significant when we think about these two themes is actually how Shakespeare presents them through the structure of the play, and actually through the overall structure. And we know in Act 1 that the witches are introduced as the three weird sisters. They are seen on the heath, and they are presented as social outcasts and are actually being unprotected. And actually, again, that was very stereotypical of the view of witches at the time, and it actually meant them was seen to be easy to blame, which again we can think about, well, actually, when people think that the witches were to blame for the actions of Macbeth throughout the play, it makes us question, is that actually true? What's also interesting is how Shakespeare presents them through the stage directions by mentioning this thunder and this lightning, almost this ominous foreboding before anything happens of these witches, before they even come on to the scene. He's almost kind of building this fear within his audiences. And we also learn as Act 1 progresses is when they are met by Macbeth and Banquo, that actually Banquo initially is, the way he describes them is, he describes them in this withered, wild and unearthly way. He says that they don't look like inhabitants or beings of the earth. He is somebody that certainly is quite curious of them within the beginning, but he's certainly not afraid of them, where Macbeth does fear them initially. Now that's quite important, because for somebody that initially fears them, he soon comes around to their way of thinking. Now we also see that this role of the supernatural, which again linked to witchcraft, can be seen in Act 2 with the representation of the dagger. Now, the dagger, obviously, which is seen by Macbeth, is a trick on his mind, and he questions, is it a dagger he sees before him? He's questioning, is it a dagger of the mind? But this is almost Shakespeare foreshadowing again the key events which are to come. And we know that Macbeth is almost using that vision as a sign to kill the king, almost as if the witches have given him that sign to go and kill the king. Now, the other significant part is in Act 4, and I mentioned this earlier on, is that actually in Act 1, the witches seek out Macbeth. They've planned to do that in the beginning of Act 1 and certainly in Act 1, Scene 2. That's what happens. However, in Act 4, it is Macbeth that then goes to the witches and he seeks them out. And it almost kind of shows his willingness to give in to them, to give over himself to these instruments of darkness, almost that he can be played by them. And that's what happens. And we know ultimately by the end he becomes disillusioned by what they've said. And as a result, he then obviously becomes this tragic hero and he meets his tragic end. And he has this massive fall from grace. Now, another thing that Shakespeare does to present these themes, and I think this is probably the most interesting for me, is how the language is used. And when we analyse the language closely, and I certainly don't have time to do that within this video, but it is interesting to look at, is that actually he does have the witches speaking in rhyming couplets and the rest of the characters actually speak in blank verse. Now that is quite significant because it actually does present them as quite mysterious and otherworldly. It also often presents them in terms of what they're saying as being confusing for an audience, which again links to this kind of hysteria that was associated with them. The other thing is that Shakespeare actually has the witches speaking in threes. They speak in threes a lot, but also in terms of what they give across as in threes. They give 3 times